So it's not quite the end of the day. I'd like to now hand over, before we can go for drinks, to Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, really to sum up some of the themes of the day and what we can expect tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. So just remember, when you take the mickey out of my shoes and you ask a question, you're going to get called the old bloke in a blue suit at the back. I'll buy you a beer later, Rich. Right, I've got the unenviable task of A, being between you and a beer, so I will be quick. But I've also got the unenviable task of trying to sum up what has been a really rich day of debate and theory and a really rich conversation about what this whole conference was about, which was about the deterrence that we are part of as an entity. So I'm going to do my very best. The first thing, and I think everyone in this room probably does know it, we are not discussing theory. We are discussing reality. We are in a competition at the very least, and possibly in conflict in most terms as well, particularly for some nations in Europe. So I've got 3 takeaways. The first one is deterrence in itself. And I think we've got an awful lot of catching up to do in terms of understanding what we mean by deterrence. We've had some really quite rich conversations. General Saltzman, I'll come back to him in a second, about how we understand it today. Because in my day, when I was operating during the Cold War, I think we did have a relatively good understanding. We knew the rules, we knew where we sat, we knew what our tasks were, and it was all we did. It's all we focused on, day in, day out, night after day. We are no longer in that space, and we have a lot of people who are having to relearn some old lessons and learn some new ones. I was looking up NATO spending for the last 10 years, believe it or not. And there are 3 countries who have increased their spending the least in the whole of NATO. Those 3 countries are the US, France, and the UK. Now, is that because they've got a nuclear deterrent and they think that that's a good reason not to have to increase conventional spend? I don't know. But it was quite stark when you look at it to see that the 3 P3, if you will, are the 3 countries that have increased their defence expenditure the least out of all of the NATO nations. And sometimes we make the most noise about the others who should be spending more, and maybe we should look at ourselves. General Saltzman said, the power of endurance to last. I didn't have Thucydides on my bingo card, but I thank him for bringing it up. And he also said it was about practical delivery of practical military means and outputs. And that was our role within the deterrent function that we fulfill. And I think there's a lot in what he said, and I think we need to think that through, because there's only so much within the military sphere we can control. We can only control what we can do, because I think the real challenge for deterrence is perhaps the political messaging that we all try and influence, try and get people to say the right things. And I think it's fair to say, because pretty sure there's no politicians in the room, we are not always well served. And I'm not saying politicians sometimes say things without thinking, some might, but they don't always say the things that we really want them to say if we're truly wanting to send a strong message of deterrence. And I particularly enjoyed the lady from Ukraine and her piece about, and some of the points she was trying to make about some of the targeting decisions and some of the rules of engagement that we have imposed on Ukraine, is that I think we have now got some politicians who think that deterrence is de-escalation. And we need to be extremely wary. It's very easy to stop wars if you just keep giving in. The trick, of course, is how you stop wars and don't lose, or you don't allow the other side to prevail. So we've got a lot of hard thinking to do. Politics is getting harder, not easier. And we have as much of a role, therefore, to help our politicians understand how this works in practice. Maybe wake them up to the fact that the military capability they've paid for isn't as infallible as they might think. And although that sometimes is unpalatable to hear, sometimes we have to tell them that. So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways. And we must not forget that Russia and China are watching. They're watching this conference because they can, because it's free to watch. They are watching what's happening in Ukraine. They watch what happens on our TVs. And they will continue to learn and they will continue to adapt. Which brings me to my second point. I've called it war at the seams. It's an old phrase I used to like, because we've talked a lot in here about the strength of alliance. And I do believe that. I was particularly enjoyed that last session I happened to be in northern Norway on Tuesday before I came here. And it was the first time I'd been that far up north in the Scandinavia countries, and just to see the geography and the scale that you're dealing with. But it is so good to have those 4 countries now fully aligned within NATO, watching our front, basically. But I think it is so important to understand that as strong as alliances are, they are also our weak point. And boy, does Russia know it. And whether they're interfering in political elections, whether they're interfering on our social media, whether they're trying to influence people, trying to drive a wedge between us and our politicians, between us and our people, or individual nations, they will continue to do that. So we can continue to see alliances as our strength, but boy, oh boy, we never forget it's also our weakness. And we should never stop trying to keep those alliances strong. I also heard said today quite a number of times by my industry colleagues, one team, one fight. Now, I've spent the last 8 years in the commercial world. I can't get 2 business units in the same company to be on the same team, let alone 2 companies to see themselves as joined up. So let's be pragmatic, let's be realistic, and let's have an open and honest conversation with the customer about the reality of that and what it actually means, because it is a little harder than perhaps we are saying. And we need to be quite honest, because ultimately we've got to make it work. And it doesn't mean that not being one team, one fight is the wrong answer, but we need to be practical and understand in the commercial realities we operate in peacetime, that is hard to do. I was going to ask for a show of hands about who thinks they're in one team, but I could have asked for a show of hands of how many people here have signed an NDA with another company in this country alone, let alone with another country, and I pretty much know that every hand would go up. That tells you all you need to know. So we must not take this for granted, and we must not assume that our buzzwords and our language is actually the reality. We've got to absolutely come to the truth, which brings me to my third point, which is productivity and risk. Quite a few people have said it. I would absolutely agree with it. In peacetime, companies worry about revenue, shareholders worry about profit, so do CFOs, and governments worry about employment and investment into particular parts of the country, levelling up whatever it might be. And those are all very noble endeavours, and that is what drives industry in peacetime. In wartime, it's about one thing, and it's about productivity. Now, are we going to wait for a war to get to that point? Are we going to have to find somehow how we bridge that spectrum and get ourselves to a more productive environment where we think differently, we operate differently? And I think we all need to think a little bit about productivity. Here in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in many other countries, we boast about the benefits of aerospace industry to our nations. We boast about the hundreds of thousands of high-paid jobs. If you're a customer of those industries and you hear people boasting about high numbers of high-paid jobs, you should be wondering where the money comes from to pay for those. So think about productivity, which also means thinking about risk. And the level of risk that we take today is not the level of risk we will need to take in wartime. And are we saying that's a binary switch? Because it isn't really. If you look at what we've done in Ukraine in integrating Western weapons onto Soviet aircraft effectively in weeks, not years, and for ones or tens of millions as opposed to hundreds of millions, we have got a lot of work to do and a lot of catching up to do. So those are my 3 takeaways. I don't think they're a fair representation of the richness or the depth of the conversation, but those for me are the things I am really trying to get my head around about how we improve and how we genuinely move the dial so that we can change this for the better. Because we can't keep talking about it as a theoretical place to be. It's where we need to be now. And that brings me to my final point. If you view this through the lens of Ukraine, and I think Justin said it, I've heard other people say it subsequently about we as air power or space power, people who want to promote what we do, should we not be worried that every time we see an argument about defence spending, it's got pictures of soldiers and pictures of ships? Just take a look at Ukraine. Thousands of casualties a day on the land. Ships being sunk on a daily basis, to the point where the Black Sea Fleet has now pretty much left Crimea empty. Those are the questions we should be posing back, saying that actually what is missing here, what is the actual difference that makes the difference in Ukraine or would make a difference? It's the air and space power element that's missing from the fight. And that is what takes you to an attritional, non-deterred type of warfare that is not the place we want to be, and we certainly don't want to be fighting that war. So we should not be shy in coming forward about why air and space power is our advantage. It is what we need to do and we need to think about investing in order to deter, however we choose to frame that. So that's it. That's my summary of today as best I can do. I'm more than happy to do a second one upstairs after a couple of beers, which will be slightly different. But I've done a few of these conferences now in trying to sum up, and you can just feel this change in attitude that is coming as we move closer and closer to really, really trying to get to grips with this. And we can't keep talking about it. Ukraine has bought us some time. The question now is, what are we going to do with the time they bought us? 17:30 upstairs for the magic, I haven't even got mine on, gold ticket holders upstairs for the reception. See you up there. It is not raining. I'm confident we will not be kicked out. For everybody else, look forward to seeing you here tomorrow. Mini F will be on bright and early. He will be speaking first, and he's going to take Q&A as well, followed by both the UK chief and the American chief speaking. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to Susanna for keeping everyone under control. Thank you to everyone who's spoken today. Thank you to the team that's kept this going. And thank you for forbearing and contributing so brilliantly. See you upstairs. Thanks, folks.